Hey guys, Jason Sheftel here, and as always, it's good to hear from you, see you guys, and it is time to talk about Afghanistan. This is going to be a really important story. I did a other video on Afghanistan about how it basically when it fell, what was going on, why this matters, how it relates to China, what might happen in Afghanistan if China's going to try and take Afghanistan. It's not really, you should check out that video if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Short of it is basically nobody wants to go into Afghanistan. The big lesson of history is don't go into Afghanistan. Don't spend your time there. Don't spend your money there. Don't let your basically society, military, any part of your system waste its energy in that region. That is sort of the big lesson of really the last 50 years of war and conflict in Afghanistan, both the Soviet conflict and the American conflict. When you go back to the British, you go back to other people, you go back really far, and this is the story all the way down through history. But nonetheless, Afghanistan is back in the news because what's happening is that Afghanistan is in the process of completely collapsing as a functional state. I mean, it's never really been a functional state, but what happened is basically a terrorist organization took over the country. Not terror, both a terrorist organization and a really messed up group of people, the Taliban in general, took over Afghanistan after years of trying to. And this is not a group of people that are really capable of running a government. They haven't run any sort of government like anyone has known in the last 20 years. And it's always going to be, it was always going to be a disaster because Afghanistan has a lot of problems that even American money and trillions of dollars in investment, a lot of it admittedly being military investment, but a lot of it also being ridiculous economic development initiatives, none of that worked. So now you're stuck. What happens to Afghanistan if, well, now that the Taliban is back and the world is changing, what happens to Afghanistan? And a great article came out about this that I'm going to just go through and talk about directly. So by great article, I mean it is interesting. It's worth talking about. What it doesn't say is really important. What it gets wrong is really important. What it focuses on is really important. What it's unwilling to admit is very important. And so this article is by Ezra Klein in the New York Times. So this is actually really interesting, right? So it's trying to get everybody's attention. I mean, for people who don't know, I mean, the New York Times is a very liberal audience. It is basically a subscription service for people who are very left-leaning at this point. That has been sort of in the cards and the focus of the organization since around 2014. It shifted its language and its reporting and its editorials all towards this. And through COVID, it did extremely well. And it's now, it's a really profitable, prominent media organization. It's no longer really the New York Times as a institutional voice separate from politics or separate from anything else. It is one of just a few remaining legacy media companies. I want to put all that out there because it's very clear at this point that everyone has to know what they're looking at and why it's shaped the way it is. So this article, the headline is trying to tell a mostly liberal audience, hey, focus on this because if you're worried about Joe Biden's prospects and the Democrats' prospects in the coming election, this could be a really big factor in it. And everyone think, oh, wow, I'm curious. What is the big thing I'm missing? What is the whatever, right? What is the thing that I need to focus on that I'm not focusing on that could determine the course of the politics that are so important to me in the coming years? And Ezra Klein goes on to talk about Afghanistan. So people were not expecting that, maybe. They knew that obviously Afghanistan is important because it's highly associated. The retreat, withdrawal from Afghanistan did not have good optics for the current administration. So that's known. But what's happening after is basically something Ezra Klein's arguing that what's happening after in Afghanistan could be even worse for Biden. And in general, he's just talking about the United States than the actual withdrawal. And so we're just going to go through. I'm going to go through a bunch of this article because it's really important. Not because of what's going to happen to Joe Biden or any of this stuff, but just because of what it's telling us about where the world is and how ready and willing people in government who are really obsessed with politics and really kind of embedded in policy and political circles, what they're focusing on, what they're really admitting or able to admit is a problem or is just something you can't deal with. So this starts out, 95% of Afghans don't have anything to eat. 9 million, 95% of Afghans don't have anything to eat. Nearly 9 million at risk of starvation, and just goes on and on. The aid request for Afghanistan is huge, and it's becoming a catastrophe, right? And this is known. I think in the last video, I talked about how there's a drought in Afghanistan that's insanely bad, kind of like the drought, long-running drought in the American Southwest. Really, really bad there. Agriculture was already a dubious proposition in Afghanistan in the first place. You're losing connections to international donors and to international aid systems, and quickly you have an agricultural crisis. You have a crisis of famine and starvation. That's what's happening. And what Ezra Klein is trying to talk about is how we being the West and particularly the United States, bears a lot of the blame for this crisis. And yeah, it goes in. It's a problem, the worst it's been in decades. And again, the reason why this is a big problem is because the United States was keeping everything running, right? It was not only the security guarantor for Afghanistan in the old regime in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, but it was also making sure all of the systems and basic subsystems of civilized life, like food, energy, transportation, etc., were provisioned in Afghanistan. A really big one it was able to do was food. The U.S. has a massive calorie surplus in the United States, and hence all the people who are obese and all the food waste, and the fact that there actually is a really sad, horrific problem with people not getting enough food and stuff in the United States. But in general, there's a massive surplus of calories at the same time. So you get that terrible contrast of obesity on one side and then malnutrition, starvation on the other. Although nothing like famine like we're talking about in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, they're talking about here is not like we're talking famine. We're talking about there's literally not enough food for people. It's a terrible thing. So 9 million people. Afghanistan has a population of roughly 45 million people. So you're looking at a really hefty chunk of this country, right? You're looking at almost 20% of the country or more that could really starve. And this is all a problem. And what Ezra's really getting into here is that it's not just the Taliban or the mismanagement and all this. There's a huge problem that is stemming from the United States here. And a lot of this article, I'm not going to go into a lot of it, but a lot of what is happening is that there is a whole sanctions regime that the United States has for terrorist organizations and basically people it doesn't like, and it uses them to stifle their access to credit and to financing and to many other things, goods, services, all that. And that is being applied to the Taliban and to basically the new Afghan government. And there's not really a good way around this. Basically, the Biden administration and any U.S. administration is in a bind. Do you suddenly start supporting the enemy that you've warred with for decades? This is the huge moral conundrum at the heart of this, right? So the U.S. is exacerbating the crisis in Afghanistan because it's a lot of mechanisms that could be used to support the Afghan population and fix some of the things like the food problem. They're much harder to do due to all of these U.S. sanctions and restrictions associated with terrorism. So that is something that's really going on. But one of the deeper things here is that Afghanistan is not a place that can survive on its own. And Ezra Klein notes this. So check this out. We left Afghanistan. We tightened a noose around its economy. And then here he says, the Afghan economy was built around our support. Roughly 45% of the GDP and 75% of government spending was foreign aid. When we abruptly cut off that cash, we sent it into a tailspin. And this is where I wouldn't say I disagree. It's like you need to expand the aperture here. So the Afghan economy was built around our support. That's not just Afghanistan. The vast majority of the world is built off of either implicit or explicit American support. So something like 2/3 to 3/4 of all countries on earth cannot provide basic services to their people. They rely on international aid and donor and other networks to basically make it work, right? To balance that budget, to balance the goods and resources budget that it needs just to serve its own people at the most basic level. And that is across the board. This isn't just an Afghanistan thing. So when you say roughly 45% of the GDP and 75% of government spending was foreign aid, that's true. But that's partially because the level of human life and the support and sort of basically civilized infrastructure that Afghanistan can actually support on its own is insanely low. It is really low. You look back at Afghanistan before the United States and Russia got there, that is more of what Afghanistan really is in terms of its economic and basically, yeah, it's economic and developmental potential. It is not a place that supports much of anything. And so this is the deeper problem. It's not that the United States although it is, the United States being there artificially raised the level of Afghani state capacity and sort of developmental capacity, because you had this influx of foreign capital and foreign know-how and foreign goods and foreign services and foreign everything from the United States, which is, the most powerful country in the world. So you had this massive influx that artificially raised what Afghanistan thought it could do. And now what's happening is that Afghanistan is plummeting below that level, not only below the level it was brought to by the United States, below the level it was beforehand, and then probably it's going even below that, because you have this massive drought, you have the total wreckage of all the state institutions. It's a disaster. You have the loss of all the connections to the rest of the world, and this is just where things are going. And yeah, and so let's just note that, and we'll just keep going here. So he's going further into a lot of this stuff about our policy, how it's hurting all the Afghanis, and it is sort of not even totally in line with our own beliefs and values. It's like this. He interviews someone who says, quote, "If state collapse was the object of policy, it could hardly be better designed," end quote. That is a blunt assessment of what exactly is going on in Afghanistan. And it just goes on. Economic collapse was predictable, and it was predicted. So he is acknowledging that this was going to happen anyway, right? I said that in another video. All sorts of people have been saying that since basically forever. It's not anything special to throw that out there. The difference is just sort of what's happened afterwards. And again, I think this is sort of a misguided focus on things. It is not about the fact that the Biden administration is in a vice and it can't suddenly, if it was bad to have the optics of the Afghan retreat, withdrawal, defeat that it had last summer, then suddenly giving all sorts of goodies to the new regime in Afghanistan is going to be a massive political blunder as well. And this is something where people need to get used to the fact that there's going to be some very bad, brutal, unfortunate moral calculus going on in the United States with regards to all sorts of other countries around the world. Yes, we did have for a long time a relatively moral, not entirely, but at least superficially moral order that everybody can point to and say they're defending and do stuff like that. Now things are really just changing. The hard truth is that Biden can't, well, Ezra Klein is saying that, he should, sort of loosen these things, prevent this terrible crisis from getting even worse. You can't lose a war, be the person who was basically on the job when the war was officially lost, and then start giving all sorts of goodies and treats and benefits basically to the people who you lost to. It is not good. Not I'm saying it's a bad thing in terms of like on some moral level. I'm saying it's really bad politics. You're going to be eviscerated by your political opponents if you go lose a war and then start basically kowtowing to the new government to support them and basically propping them up, right? Because this is what we're saying. We either prop up this new government in Afghanistan, or the three options are basically prop it up or leave it alone or sort of add all these sort of sanctions that make its life even more difficult. These are kind of the three options. And I think that the option of actually propping it up again is gone. I don't think the American people or the American government or anything is going to allow that to happen. I think people just want no money at all going to Afghanistan, as horrible as that is. The U.S. is still the largest donor to Afghanistan. Ezra Klein says this in his article. It's like 500 million. Ooh, I should really look at it this way. All right, let me actually make that perfect so I can have it look like I'm actually looking at the article in this. That's very cool. So yeah, so you look, and Ezra Klein also says $500 million or so a year goes from the United States to Afghanistan. This is a real thing. This is the largest flow of external capital into the country. But the truth is, the American people will probably be happier if that was closer to zero, not higher, right? And even if the U.S. isn't necessarily giving more money, channeling U.S. resources through international or multilateral institutions that then go to Afghanistan, all of this stuff, the cold hard truth is too many trillions were spent here. And what Ezra Klein is noting is that, what he's touching on is the fact that all this money that has been spent and all of these security dilemmas that started, that really gained steam during that long war, they're still kind of with us, and there's no good answers to them. And what I'm saying, in addition, that people should really pay attention to is this is not just an Afghanistan thing. This is a global thing. This And like I said, almost 3/4 of the countries on Earth, and probably with COVID now, it's probably 3/4 or more, require government assistance, foreign assistance to for the governments to provide basic services to their people. So this is a massive problem. And let's go through a little more of this article. It's easy to criticize. So the sanctions, right? So he is saying like the U.S. hasn't imposed any new sanctions, right? There's not like the government has been newly punitive to Afghanistan. It is just sort of going through the motions of what it is applying to terrorist networks and other things like that. And the government, the U.S. government, is kind of bending over backwards to try and basically square a circle here about what to do with Afghanistan. And we'll just keep going. Right, this is very important actually in the Afghanistan. Then there's Afghanistan's foreign assets. The Afghani, the currency, it's a very weak currency, and much of the country's commerce and savings take place in dollars. This is a really bad sign for Afghanistan in general. It makes almost everything it does more difficult. It loses control over its own monetary policy. All this stuff is well known. And this is all right. So he's going on about all of this stuff about these sanctions, how they're being applied, and the logic is flawed, et cetera, et cetera. The technical stuff about whoever, where assets actually belong, and the government versus the people, et cetera. Let me see this. One of the lawyers, and then he is acknowledging there's a lot of in this article too. You're starting to see this sense that even though the United States is part of, well, yeah, I mean the artificially bringing up a country to a certain level and then helping to tear it down, that makes the United States somewhat a part of this problem. If Afghanistan had just been left to itself, it's much worse, right? There's this, I mean, it's similar to sort of the cognitive bias of loss aversion. If you already have something and then you lose it, it's much worse than not really having anything at all and then just continuing to not have anything at all. So there's a real thing here, and we'll just keep going. Sanctions and seizures. This is all normal. The U.S. official descriptions of why it's doing things are not the best, right? And the U.S. still wants leverage. That's what's going on. Destabilize, blah, 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 blah. I mean, right, there's this whole thing. The U.S. doesn't really have, the truth of the matter is the U.S. doesn't have a policy towards Afghanistan at all. This is maybe another of those deep things that people need to realize. The U.S. policy towards most countries is not a real policy. Anyone who's just watched U.S., really starting the Trump administration, became very clear. The U.S. just doesn't care about most countries. That's the cold, hard truth. It doesn't have a policy at all. It's just doesn't care. And a lot of U.S. policy in general is basically what this is saying is to gain leverage. Often leverage over one country, even if you don't like that country, is useful in negotiations with another country that you may care about. A lot of stuff like that goes on in East Asia with China, and also in Central Asia, also with China, all around the world with China. But the point is that the U.S. just doesn't care at all. I mean, there's this idea in foreign policy circles that the U.S. has some goal for all countries and all relationships. The truth, the cold hard truth, is that it doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't. And this is one of those things we're going to have to learn to accept on a deep level, because the world is evolving and changing, and the old system that's kept it together is crumbling. And a lot of what the mood behind Ezra Klein's article is this worry and fear about what exactly this new world we're entering into is and what it's going to look like. Because if you look, I'm already talking about a world that's like, well, the U.S. doesn't care about people. The moral foundations of things are kind of broken. It's much more of a self-interested game. This is not a pretty pleasant world. And another thing that's very important is the thrust of an article like Ezra's, this idea that Joe Biden or whoever needs to change this and fix things, or otherwise it'll be a big disaster. This is an idea that we can, if we do a couple things, if the government does a couple things, if the United States does a couple things, it can shore up this moral world order that we've all known and loved for so long. Known and loved, or just accepted, or just railed against, or whatever it is. But the truth is, this moral order is not coming back, right? We just had a Russian quasi-invasion of Ukraine, most likely a coming invasion of Ukraine. There's just, it's a very clear sign that there is a end to this passive faux unity of a global world that we've been talking about for a long time. Countries are countries. They have their interests. They're not interested in most other countries, right? So Russia really cares about a couple countries around it and some of its customers and some of its foreign states that can threaten it, like the United States. That's kind of what it cares about. And the United States also is the same way. And this is the key thing. The United States cared or seemed to care about the entire world. A, because the United States actually has done a lot of good all around the world, way more good, I believe, than the vast majority of any country, of all countries ever. From 1945 to 2020 was by far the best period for global development anywhere in history, bar none. That was the Pax Americana. That was all of that. The U.S. allowed the self-determination of nations. It gave them access to goods and markets all around the world. It was unprecedented, right? But the truth is that era is also just coming to an end. And I'm going to go and do more videos about what the new contours of what's coming and what that all looks like. But you got to accept that that's coming to an end. And the reason the U.S. did all that, it didn't just create a Pax Americana purely out of the goodness of its own heart, although there was part of that. It was trying to basically create a counterweight to the Soviet Union. This was originally part of this whole strategic gambit, everything related to the Cold War. Afterwards, it became a policy of global cooperation and unity, and there were dependencies in energy and other systems that the U.S. felt it really needed to take advantage of the larger system it had built, right? So the truth is, a lot of things that Russia and China will say that the U.S. had been basically using these old systems for its own benefit for a long time. It's not entirely wrong. It's not entirely right. There's a kernel of truth to it. And now the world we're entering is just this entire global world order that was created, that had a reason, is coming to an end. And the U.S. itself is going to revert to having a much smaller group of countries that it's interested in, right? That's just the way it works. The same way China has a few countries that it's interested in. Russia has a few countries that it's interested in. Argentina has a few countries that it's interested in. The idea that the U.S. cares about the entire world and every country individually is a bit romantic, a bit doe-eyed, a bit magical, and probably not something we should hang our hats on. It's not the best way to characterize what countries care about, why they're doing the things they do, and then especially now, how when we're trying to find out what the new contours of the kind of world we're entering looks like, it's a very bad policy to suddenly think that the U.S. cares about everything. And Afghanistan is a great place to talk about this, because Afghanistan is something the U.S. really has no interest in any way. Even Russia and China don't have any interest in this country in a deep way. And basically terrorism was the original reason. And then everything after that has just been very, very, very poorly reasoned why there's a U.S. interest in Afghanistan. And we're really at the point where no government, whether it's Democrat or Republican, or any moral valence, whether it's a totally self-interested government, totally economically nationalist, more internationalist, Afghanistan is one of the hardest places to justify any investment ever, anymore, of all the countries on earth, right? And the biggest way to suggest greater investment is actually what Ezra Klein is doing, which is to say it's the very fact that we put so much time into it, and that when we took away all that time, that effort, that energy, those resources, we actually are contributing in some part to this crisis, right? So that's actually the argument here is relatively sound on that front, but it's just not aligned to the world we're entering. And I think Ezra Klein in this article and a lot of the New York Times editorial section in general is very, very invested in trying to do a couple technical, mechanical changes to the system, a little investment here, a little investment there, with the idea that it'll actually be able to resurrect or reinvigorate the broader global system. And I just think that's totally false. And it's a really dangerous idea, because it ends up with a lot of very expensive global whack-a-mole that's not going to work, right? So let's just keep going with this article real quick. Right, economic weapons, that these sanctions will destabilize, right? The idea is that the U.S. is still kind of wants to destabilize the Taliban government, but there's of course no other government that could take over Afghanistan, so there's no real way this works. But as in many other places, the U.S. government just runs on autopilot. The entire global system the U.S. built was running on autopilot for decades after 1991, right? And then the U.S. sanctions regime, the U.S. Global counterterrorism efforts, all of this runs on autopilot. People need to always keep this in mind. Most of the government is agencies that are just sort of implementing regulations that are passed down over time. They become basically part of the the framework, part of the skeleton of how the things move and the muscles of the government, and it just continues to operate them mechanically. It is very difficult to get these changes to happen. So again, why this Ezra Klein op-ed in general, one of the mechanisms for trying to affect change from the government to the in the government from the outside is to write articles like this that change the mood or the opinion or the perception or the attention of the public, and also in doing so focus the government on these problems, draw attention to these sorts of things. This is the whole basis of investigative journalism in general, which is actually the core form of journalism in general. So that's what's going on. And yeah, so it just keeps going on. It is only the Afghanistan suffering at this point, right? This is a very classic thing, U.S. particular division to make. You have the government of a country and you have its people. This is an old idea. It's going to be something that's also increasingly dubious around the world, right? So the U.S. particularly, let's use just the 20th century in general. At the start of the century, there was empires over most of the world. There was not free peoples. The U.S. advocated for national self-determination. This was the whole Woodrow Wilson thing, World War I. You started to get a large world of nations, right? Empires broke up. And then you had the Cold War, and you suddenly had all these nations. Suddenly the U.S. really wanted, it wanted independent nations with their own governments to also agree with the United States. So the U.S. started to do a lot of, it was doing this in Latin America in particular earlier on, but globally started to support all sorts of movements to change governments in one place, and would say that this government doesn't believe in the people and this government is bad, or this government, one government would, you'd want a monarch because there is actually stable, it's good for U.S. interests. Another country you'd want a democracy because it's bad for Soviet interests, et cetera, et cetera. It was extremely nuanced, and it was often very just aligned with U.S. particular interests, often corporate interests, all sorts of interests, right? So this is the background to this idea of talking about the specific people in a country and then the government itself. And the best place to kind of knock this away is with China. China, mainland China, is a place where the people and the government are inextricably linked and have been for millennia. Although the Chinese government, it invariably becomes a sort of decadent, difficult, heinous, tyrannical sort of regime as it tries to keep everything together in that country. You can't really break apart the Chinese government from the Chinese people in any sort of honest way. If you leave China, you go to Taiwan, you go to Hong Kong, historically, before the last couple of years, or you go to basically Anglo countries, you go to England, you go to Australia, you go to Canada, you go to the United States, you see Chinese people of Chinese ethnic descent massively succeeding. They participate in democracies, economic wealth, everything. But you go to mainland China itself, very different. Doesn't matter if the political state is horrible and tyrannical. You get a people that are really, part and parcel of this state, right? It is a people and a state in one region, and they're moving together through history. So right now, if you want to try and support the Chinese people, you could say, oh, well, we should get rid of this tyrannical regime. But the end result will be massive, massive chaos and violence all across China, with really no state that could, no group that could deal with it unless it recreated the massive hierarchical institutional force of something like the Communist Party, and it regained the military power and the coercive force to be able to take control of the country. Just the process of moving China back to a ordered state out of a very, very chaotic phase would involve the recreation of something that would inevitably become like the Communist Party you see today and the Communist state you see today in China. And that's just the way it is. This is the reality of living in China. This is the reality of being Chinese in China. And we can say what we want about, yes, you can definitely make these divisions analytically and mentally between a country and its people, but what you can actually do about this is very different. And obviously Afghanistan and Iraq are a great example. The U.S. made a big point of division between the Afghani people and the terrible Taliban government. And it went there, wasted 20 years, and all that Afghanistan got back was just the Taliban in general, right? You do the same thing in Iraq. You make a big division between the noble Iraqi people with their grand history and the terrible Ba'athist Saddam Hussein regime. You do that, you end up with a huge mess in Iraq right now. Turns out that a strong political figure and a strong very authoritarian state for the underlying, complexity and difficulties within the makeup of Iraq and its sort of artificial borders and artificial, entirely artificial nature actually worked better. Or it didn't necessarily work better, but it's one of a very small number of options, all of which aren't very good. So that's kind of what you end up with. So that's definitely something to also keep in mind when you see people talking about the people and the government as if they are totally separate things. They're not. The government tends to evolve along with the people, right? And the people evolve and the government both evolve out of the place you're in, right? If you're in Afghanistan, you have very limited options. You're not going to be developing Boeing jets and going to the moon. It's a very, very difficult concept to get our heads around. And a lot of these op-eds, a lot of the journalism around this stuff is just super superficially moralistic and idealistic, and just it misses these deeper connections. And you don't learn this stuff, and it gets to a point where it's really bad, where we're entering the world we're entering now, where just trying to get a basic read on what is possible and what is impossible and where things are headed is really tough, because we have all these abstractions that almost entirely come from journalism for the average person, that we don't even know how to get a handle on these things. So I'm going to keep going on this article, but definitely keep that in mind. The people and the government are both developments out of the specific place that a state, that the nation state is embedded on this planet, right? On this world. There's a world map, and you're there, and that's where your history is, and that is a big reason why you are the way that you are. So the reality is the only thing Washington has control over is its actions. It has a choice. So, right, you can either make things worse for Afghanis, or you can make things better. This is a sort of moral, sympathetic argument. Things are definitely bad. Basically, he's saying things are terrible and they're heading towards disaster, but maybe we should not be making things worse. It's kind of a weak argument in general, right? Things are headed towards disaster. Truth is, most people just don't care. And there's no moral valence about that. I mean, it's not, there's a big thing, a big movement in the world today to try and get everyone to care about everything. You need to care about a massive tsunami in South Asia. You need to care about the trials and tribulations of people who are working in garment factories in parts of the world. You need to care about everything, about every single part of, every single event or series of events in the world that touches our heartstrings, right? And this is a way to get people's sympathy and attention focused on all these issues. But the truth is, there's so many things going on. Nobody can pay attention to all of it. And you can't actually care about everything. You really can't. And most people, especially once you have children, people tend to just care about their children. That's like all you have the time for. You have the time to work and care about your children and talk to a couple friends, and that's about it. It is a very different thing when the whole world is trying to push your attention and your sympathy all around to every sort of issue. It's very good for media organizations, but it is not an effective way to mobilize public attention or enthusiasm or basically consistent effort towards an issue. What we basically had since 1991 is all of these media organizations just telling you to care about, the children of Darfur or the child soldiers in the Congo and all this, and then you just quickly forget. You quickly forget, and nothing gets done, and it reemerges, and people feel distraught and angry and bitter and powerless, and it just causes everybody to actually pull back. One of the things we're seeing, and the reason that why an article like this is worth talking about and actually explicitly bringing up the fact that people don't care, is important, because people are exhausted in the United States trying to care about everything all around the world when there's been so little done. And even worse, when all of the systems that made things okay, relatively okay in the world, that allowed the 75% of countries that can't function on their own to actually function to some degree, as all that fades, your sympathy is going to be pulled everywhere, even more, when it was already being pulled everywhere all the time. This is a big reason why you're going to see a huge recoil of people in the United States. Obviously, this has already happened with Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. People just don't want anything to do with any of this. And this is how you get a period of isolationism. This is how it happens, right? This is a big, and it's happening in a real major way when you have all this negative news, and especially now with COVID. COVID was so damaging for so many people socially and personally and economically just within the United States, that to suddenly start flinging money around the world to other places to tell them that that's where you have to focus, none of this is going to play. And it's tough. And a lot of people have focused on foreign policy for a long time, who've been writing about it in the Wall Street Journal, in New York Times, and other places. it is going to be a large, painful adjustment period to accept that the United States is going to be self-absorbed and navel-gazing and dismissive of the rest of the world, and that is part of the soil in which you're going to have to make your arguments. Basically, that's just the way it's going to be. You can't try. You can try and change that. It's just not going to work. And learning to live with it is going to be a huge, huge difficulty. Something that everybody who's reading these sorts of op-eds and stuff needs to be aware of. That there's always a sense in an op-ed that, oh, we could do something about it. We could change it. We could make it better right away. Just make this change. And you just never see these changes get made. And reading a lot of this stuff will often make you feel worse because you think things can happen that really can't happen that easily. You think they can happen and they're just not happening. And it feels like all the low-hanging fruit we could be making better are just sitting there and never getting plucked. So it's even worse feeling. And it's another reason why a lot of people are just abandoning these news sites and abandoning news, and particularly foreign news and all this stuff, just in droves, right? I mean, I mentioned at the beginning that the New York Times has had to become more of a small, focused, niche, subscriber-based media organization oriented more towards the left, because that is where it had a business logic. Because those are the people who are very earnest and interested in this stuff, hopelessly interested and hopelessly earnest about what can be done in a lot of ways. And that is where you have a major market for this content. You don't have a major market for New York Times content in the vast majority of the US population. And that's a really important reality to be aware of. If you were one of these subscribers or readers, or if you're someone who's listening to me and they're just like, well, I've never read this stuff. Why is he talking about an op-ed I don't care about? It's the exact same thing, right? There's a group of people that really care about this, and the language and the way they talk about things, the expectations embedded in it are very important. They're a symbol of where things are for a certain segment of the US electorate, really, both in the people who are creating the content and in the people who are listening to it. So let's keep going. There's a framework that has lost its logic. Very true. U.S. is spending precious time and energy fighting itself. Very true, but it does that in all sorts of ways, all over the place. Clarifying exceptions and licenses. Yep, it's just like we're trying to do this bureaucratic improvements slowly. Minor improvements here. How impossible is a task? I repeatedly hear. Yep. So yeah, so just going in how all this stuff is just difficult. All right, let's talk about locking the legs out of the banking sector. Yeah, here it is. Here's great. I found it hard in my conversations with Biden officials to get them to zoom out to explain how our various policies fit into a sensible, humane whole. This is the truth. There is no sensible, humane whole. And it is, and this is particularly on the left, this is one of the hardest things to accept, that there is not a moral, practical plan for this relationship, or for basically any other, like really any other. If you want to dive into the relationship, for example, between the United States and the United Kingdom, this was called the special relationship. It's an alliance, which I don't like those words anymore, but it is an alliance that has been held up throughout history, even really not through the last 75 years, as being a key one of the core alliances of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. Truth is, this has never been what it sounded like. It was a very useful thing for Britain. It was, the U.S. got a lot out of it during 1940, before the World War II, and then immediately afterwards. But in the last few years, let's just say last 15 years, the Britain competes and clashes with the United States in as many ways as it sort of cooperates and meshes in with the United States. London is a competitor to New York, as one example. And actually, that's probably the best example, because it's the main functioning industry in England now is really this financial sector, and it's massive play, a heft in the UK and in Europe for a lot of financial transactions. That's a huge thing, but it goes against the United States. The US would rather have a lot of this work in New York for its own people, etc. And in general, a lot of Britain's value comes from its ability to be in Europe, but not quite in Europe. And it basically allows the US to have a really close relationship to a country that's kind of like Japan in East Asia, These are valuable for the U.S. for reasons that wouldn't be really acceptable if I laid them out to a British ambassador. The actual benefits of this relationship, they're much more strategic and self-interested than people want to admit. And it's been that way also on the British side from the beginning. I mean, this is the reason it was called the special relationship. I'm pretty sure this was related to Winston Churchill. I'm pretty sure it was early on something that was emphasized on the British side, because they were trying to find their own place in the in the de-imperializing world of, the early Cold War. And aligning yourself to the United States, it gave you both something grander than just being a small European island nation. It connects you back to the sort of broader Anglosphere that became the sort of heirs of the Commonwealth states, etc. There was a whole internal British political idea and sort of self-concept that's embedded in that. It was just as sort of self-absorbed as the American side of things, right? So these alliances, these connections, they're sensible, logical, humane whole. It's just never existed in most places, right? Even like I was saying earlier, the sensible, humane whole that created the Pax Americana was very, very, very embedded in the strategic conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. It is so prominent that it's hard to discuss the idea of a Pax Americana without it. If you look at what's happened since 1991, you can see there's been a major change in the character of it, the quality of it, in the essential nature of it. And that is something that we haven't really been able to acknowledge, right? And so I'm going to keep going with what Ezra was saying. But I think this line, I'm just going to repeat it one more time for people just to hear it, because it's very important. Quote, "I found it hard in my conversations with Biden officials to get them to zoom out to explain how our various policies fit into a sensible, humane whole," end quote. And you can hear his own anger and frustration, right? Because he found it hard. He wanted to go. He went to these officials hoping to find, a business plan, basically an integrated, logical business plan that could work and that he agreed with and that he felt aligned with his values, and he could not find it. This is what we're going to experience. People, particularly more on the left, or identify more that way, will experience this more, because the center left is really the core bedrock of this international liberal global consensus type thing I've been talking about. This is where this is a major differentiating factor between sort of the progressives farther on the left and the more middle center left in general. And there's a lot to talk about actually about the center left and its complicity in a lot of ways in the failures of Afghanistan, because it was actually the center left that was the most invested in trying to make Afghanistan work, or in going through the motions of attempting to make Afghanistan work because of what it said about the international system and all this needs to protect it and stuff. The ridiculous projects that were funded, these art projects and other bizarre things in Afghanistan, to university professors, all this stuff. Some of it is so absurd, it would boggle the mind, right? So there's often this critique of American politics where it's the far left and far right, which are the terrible ones. But in many ways, it's often when you have these autopilot governments, autopilot systems, it's often the center left or center right that are most absurd in their attempts to maintain a unworkable status quo, right? You see that actually in places like Germany in particular, which has basically only ever been run by a center left and a center right. So good to keep in mind. So let's keep going with Ezra Klein here. Yeah, I mean, this is actually perfect. This is what I've been saying. I think I'm just going to quote from him for everybody. Quote, "But this is how it looks to me and to many analysts I spoke to. Over 20 years, the United States built an aid-dependent economy in Afghanistan. When we left, we withdrew the aid on which it depended. When the Taliban took over, we turned the sanctions and financial weapons we'd wield against them, against the government and country they now controlled. We comfort ourselves by saying we are the largest donor to the Afghanistan relief effort, but we are also a major reason the crisis is dire in the first place, and we continue to be." So the beginning of this statement is great. Over 20 years, the U.S. built an aid-dependent economy in Afghanistan. When we left, we withdrew the aid on which it depended. This is going to be the story of a lot of the world in the coming years. This is why this article is worth going through, and this is why talking about Afghanistan is worth it, because Afghanistan this is where it began, and it's beginning in a real way. So instead of the U.S. supporting in many implicit ways that are less overt and tangible the entire global system and the economies of the vast majority of the world. We are talking about a specific country where the US was tangibly, physically embedded in the country, spending money, and it still failed. And the reason that Afghanistan became what it was is because, and the rest of the world, is because the US allowed an aid-dependent economy to be built. Like I've said multiple times, most of the world can't survive on its own resources. And the global maritime trading system the US built, the global financial system, the system for capital flows and for investment and for training and for education, for all the people who managed to get trained in the United States and they couldn't get trained anywhere else. All of this is a big reason why you have the world we have. We have so many countries that can even function. But they are just as aid dependent as Afghanistan. Not just as aid dependent. Afghanistan is really bad, but the idea is really the same. This is a world. This is a aid-dependent world, and we are living in a period where that aid is going to be clawed back and pulled away. And there's not going to be a great way to change this. There's no argument you can make to the US population to make it, and there's no global foreign enemy that you can use to unify the country against or recreate a global system against. China is the country that you would want to do this against, but it doesn't work, right? The reason NATO worked is in basically the whole US trading system, the whole GATT system, all of that is because the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact countries weren't a part of it. They were part of another system. China is entirely dependent on the US system as well. So you can't make it out to be the big bad in this deeper way that I'm talking about. Yes, it is a horrible regime inimical to all Western values, right? From our perspective, there's no regime we would less like to be ruled by in a lot of ways. Not entirely, actually, particularly, particularly on the center. Actually, well, it's both left and right, but a lot on the left, you'll hear a lot of people who are very admiring of China because of all the things it's able to do, all the major initiatives it's able to accomplish. Typically, the right only tends to care as much about military power. The left would love to have more done on the environment, on transportation, on housing, and all of these things. And China has really been able to do all sorts of things in this massive China scale way. And that's very impressive to a lot of people. But nonetheless, the overall social difficulties of living in China, when you're accustomed to the liberties of the United States, it's pretty hard to imagine. But the truth again is that China is not enough to be this pole the US can recreate the system around, right? You can't do it. And the articles like this and authors like Ezra Klein are going to probably spend a few years trying to figure out how we recreate a moral order, right? And typically you'll see often intellectuals on the left and the right, when the US gets into an isolationist phase, they're there trying to imagine what the better world can be. And that is actually more of what articles like this are about. We're moving into a phase where this is becoming more of the imaginary process of looking at where the world is heading and how it's going in a really bad direction, and how maybe 15 or 20 years from now we could do something important to change it when there's more of a will, when there's more national resources, when there's been technological developments to make things possible, right? If you looked in the 1930s, you wanted to improve the whole world, wouldn't have been easy to do. The U.S. definitely couldn't do it by itself, but you look at the 1950s, suddenly the U.S. can do it, right? There's a massive technological boom, industrial boom, war plant development, all that kind of stuff. It was huge, and it enabled a lot of things. You had just massive increase in all sorts of science and technological fields, right, in the decades right after World War II, during and right after World War II, which was just huge. And we're going to need something like that to recreate this material and moral order that people have grown accustomed to. In the meantime, until you have major developments in agriculture, in energy, in transportation in a lot of ways, in a host of industries, you're not going to be able to get this. And there is not the resources or the will to do so in the meantime. And I think that is a really important thing to keep in mind. I'm going to just kind of briefly now go through the rest of this article. I think I've touched on most of the things I wanted to, but I'm here, it's here. Let's just go through the rest of it. See if there's anything really interesting. I actually don't even think I made it this way, so I'm as new to anything we're reading now as you guys. Right, we comfort ourselves. The crisis will not be solved. This is important. Yeah, the crisis will not be solved by any more humanitarian aid. Aid cannot make up for an economy deprived of oxygen. this is a bit nonsense. Yeah, so this is by the president of the International Rescue Committee. The truth is, and what a lot of people involved in foreign development, my background is also in development, and the what nobody wants to admit is that aid, most economies do not do not have what it takes to function in the modern world, right? Most economies aren't industrialized and have no path to even industrializing. Afghanistan is never going to industrialize. Iraq is never going to industrialize, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just one step in everything you need to really become a high income, sustainable, a large sustainable economy characterized by high incomes and running on your own fuel. And the vast majority of countries can't do that. I know I've repeated that a lot in this live stream, but people need to remember this. And when you listen to guys like this, who I have no bone against any of these guys, but it's just really important because this is always what's unsaid. Aid cannot make up for an economy deprived of oxygen. The truth is, Afghanistan just doesn't have, there is no oxygen in Afghanistan. Its natural state is to be deprived, is to be economically deprived. And that's the truth. And what happens is that we have a very low bar for humanitarian disasters, in the sense that a lot of countries on earth would be very close to a humanitarian disaster left to their own devices. And we've done a lot to try and make things better, but you can't solve everything. And here's a good line. Economic collapse makes the humanitarian challenge, like running up an escalator that's going down faster and faster, becomes impossible. That is why we need today is not just for more aid, it's for different policy. And the key problem is, what is the policy? If you don't give aid to Afghanistan, what is the policy to make Afghanistan better? This is the core challenge in development. This is the thing everyone has struggled with for decades now, 30 years really, I'd say, since the end of the Cold War. The idea, the animating spirit behind what would happen after the Cold War is, well, what if we can actually make most of the countries on earth work? We use the technology, we use the new internet technologies, we use new economic capacities, we use new technology, we use everything to just try and make it work for so many countries. What we realize is most countries still don't work. And what I was arguing a second ago is that even 15, 20 years from now, the only way things would work is if there are new technologies to make it happen. And technology, the sad truth is technology can't solve most of these problems. They can't solve social challenges. They often make a lot of things worse. And a lot of countries are what they are because of their geography, and that just can't change. The most powerful technologies change or readjust or redefine what geography means. And most countries have such bad geography that doesn't even matter. And that's very important. It's very important that geographic basis of this stuff is the key difference between someone like me and most of these economic writers. It is the key question in economics, really since the 1990s, I'd say again, has been, where's the basis for things? Does it lie in institutions, which is a super vague abstraction, which people should really be dubious of? Does it lie in institutions, or does it lie in geography? This is a core question of economic development, basically the history of economics and of national growth and national potential. And it gives us a lot of insight into where things are going, into the future, and into the nature of the present. And I think without question, the answer is geography. Things do emerge out of geography. The obvious thing is actually the institutions themselves emerge out of geography. But this has been booted, and just banished from the academy for 30 years. And now we're going to see a real problem because people don't have the framework to actually look at these things. And we have a moral idealistic vision of humanity and ourselves that makes it even harder to look at the actual reality of things. And the people who are often saying, oh, I live in touch with reality, and I'm actually doing the right thing, and I'm not trying to do anything that's too ideal. All these guys who are like the hard-nosed realists, they're often like weirdly cruel and unpleasant, right? So you're just kind of like, well, you're kind of stuck. You're really in a bind. But that is the unfortunate truth. And economic collapse and humanitarian challenges, the unfortunate reality for a lot of the world. And it's not like I'm saying this is coming and there's doom coming. This is what's going on with COVID. This is what's happening with COVID right now. All around the world, there's all these problems. And the challenges, for example, in India with COVID, where you have, let's say, 300 million people, relatively close to the US population, of children who are basically have lost schooling that they can't afford to lose, and many are just dropping out of education in general. That's a huge problem. You actually have the percentage of the Indian labor force that is in agriculture has actually increased, which is the opposite of what you want to see when you actually need to move you need to basically roll down the path of the agricultural transition and move away from low value, low efficiency agriculture and towards higher value, higher efficiency agriculture, in addition to all sorts of industrial and service jobs, right? That's not what we're seeing in India. You're seeing the actual regression to something even worse. And to make that even worse, you also have hundreds of millions of kids that you actually need to power your economy later. You need them to get educated to be able to take upon themselves greater challenges and more difficult tasks and basically power into higher income roles that would then be a lot of the income and the revenue for government and for later investment and for trying to spiral up your country into higher levels of economic growth and national attainment. And that is going in the opposite direction in India, right? That is and it's going like that all around the world, and it's really bad in Latin America. But that is what's happening now. So it's not me just saying that bad things are coming. Bad things are already here. And again, we're so focused on the United States and COVID and the US response to COVID and how bad it is and how, and then realistic, more personally, the people we've lost or the people we've seen suffer or the sense of normality or normalcy that we want. And we're just not as interested in the rest of the world. And you start to look at the challenges of, well, how would the US solve COVID for the rest of the world? How would the US has to give billions of vaccines and it's a changing virus, so the vaccines don't work and you have to redo them. And you can't solve this problem either. And COVID is actually horribly, the response to COVID is the response that people should expect for a lot of global challenges going forward. The global institutions, the multilateral institutions are weak and troubled. The will is diffuse and fragmentary, and the sense of self-absorption in every nation is just going up. In China, it's going up to levels of crazy navel-gazing propaganda and absurdity that it hasn't reached in decades. In the United States, there's just the self-absorption, and then in Europe, it has its own challenges and problems. And this is the way things are going to go. So COVID is actually is the terrible model for the way things like climate change will probably be addressed, right? That's the brutal, brutal truth, right? There's going to be no sensible, humane, global response to climate change, almost certainly, right? You have too many countries that are, close to economic collapse and humanitarian disaster, and their ability to try and say we're going to play a huge role in transforming everything in the world, it's just not going to happen. And that's a sad truth and a bit of an aside, but let's do this last article, see if there's anything else. I make no pretense of knowing how to solve a problem as wicked as Afghanistan. Biden chose this policy for his own legacy, and more important, for the tens of millions of human beings suffering in Afghanistan. He needs to figure out how to fix it. And this isn't really, the truth is this article isn't even really about Afghanistan. Like I said, this is about the world in general. This is Ezra Klein's, scream trying to figure out what to do as this moral and material world that we've known and that has done so much good crumbles beneath our feet. And I too am not going to right now try and give a huge, massive answer to this wicked problem, but I was trying to provide a bit of context to where things are going and why. I think this article was really great, really useful way to think about some of it. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll be doing obviously more videos and more content. It's definitely coming. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, definitely like it, share it, subscribe, throw on notifications. You'll get more videos like this. And a lot of the stuff I'm doing soon, once this book in particular is done, is going to be really cool. You guys will definitely like it. So stay tuned, and I will